He would go to the swimming pool. I go set the pool up for him.
Nancy Rooks never wanted to be famous. She never sold a story, never chased a camera, and when others who had stood inside Graceland cashed in on the Presley name, she stayed quiet and kept her memories folded close like the pressed sheets she tended in those upstairs rooms. For nearly half a century, silence was her choice, and she held to it. But in the final months of her life, something shifted in her, and what came out of her mouth during those last quiet conversations was not what anyone expected. Not scandal, not conspiracy. Something far more unsettling than either, a truth so plain and so human that it cuts through 50 years of mythology and leaves you rethinking how the story of Elvis Presley's final days was ever told in the first place. She had cooked his meals, cleaned his rooms, and sat nearby when the house fell so quiet you could feel the loneliness pressing against the walls. Nancy Rooks was not a background figure in that world. She was the connective tissue of daily life inside one of the most recognized homes in American music history, and she chose, for most of her life, to say almost nothing about what she witnessed there. That choice came from someone who understood that certain truths, once spoken, cannot be recalled. So she waited. She waited until age and the nearness of her own death finally made the waiting feel like the wrong thing to do. And what she released in those final months changes the way we understand Elvis as a man, not the rock and roll icon, not the cultural legend, the man. Nancy arrived at Graceland almost by accident, placed there temporarily through an agency while another worker was out sick. Vernon Presley noticed something in her almost immediately. A steadiness, a quiet competence that stood apart in a household that ran loud and unpredictably on someone else's terms. Vernon asked her to stay, and that single yes turned into 10 years inside one of the most storied private residences in American popular culture. Her shift started around 5 each evening and ran well past midnight because Elvis kept no schedule that resembled anything close to normal. He woke late, ate late, and moved through his days at a rhythm entirely his own, and Nancy adjusted her life around it without complaint, preparing peanut butter and banana sandwiches, fried pickles, meatloaf, and cornbread in the hours when the rest of Memphis slept. What she witnessed during those 10 years was never the king. The king existed on stage and in the tabloids and in the minds of fans who had built an icon from the biography of a man they'd never actually met. What Nancy saw was the person underneath all of that, barefoot on the stairs with his hair still messy, asking if there was any peach cobbler left, sitting quietly in the kitchen with her and his grandmother Minnie May singing gospel hymns, not performing, just filling the silence with something warm. That version of Elvis, the one stripped of the rhinestones and the mythology, was the one she protected for nearly 50 years, and it was that version she decided near the end of her life to finally speak about. She did write books. Inside Graceland offered readers a carefully drawn portrait of those years, told with dignity and without sensationalism, never crossing into exposé territory, never betraying what she felt she still owed the man she had served. Fans valued those books because they felt honest, like being let through a side door without anyone making a production of it. But even in those pages, corners stayed unturned. Doors stayed closed. The full weight of what she knew sat quietly behind the words she published, patient and unmoved, waiting for a time she hadn't quite named yet. The summer of 1977 carried a different feeling inside Graceland, and the people who were there during those weeks have said so in various ways over the decades since. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would have made someone stop and declare that something was badly wrong, but a slow shift of the kind that only becomes visible in hindsight. Elvis was heavier, quieter, and moving differently through the house. His appetite came and went unpredictably, some nights demanding full meals, other nights settling for water or juice. Tour dates sat on the calendar. Road plans were real, and that fact matters, because it means the people closest to him were not watching a man prepare to die. They were watching a man prepare to leave on tour. The day before he died, racquetball at the Graceland court, and the detail has been repeated so many times it has become almost decorative in the official timeline. What rarely gets said is how unremarkable that day felt to everyone inside the house. He moved through it active, sweating from the game, laughing in and out of the kitchen with people around him, and nothing about it looked like the last day of anything. That gap between how ordinary it felt and what it turned out to be is exactly where so much of the grief got stuck for the people who loved him. Nancy remembered the early hours of August 16th with a clarity that never softened over time. He had come back from racquetball, standing on the steps outside the kitchen, tired but alert in the way physical exertion leaves a person present. She offered him food the way she always did. He shook his head and told her he wanted sleep, but first he wanted water. She asked Pauline to bring it in one of those plastic jugs with a grip handle on the side, and when Elvis took that jug, what happened next stayed with both women for the rest of their lives. He drank it fast, not sipping, not pausing, drinking like a man who hadn't had water in days. Pauline said afterward she had never known him to grab water and drink it like that, and Nancy told her in the moment he was just overheated from the game. That was the logical explanation, and she accepted it. But that moment kept returning to her over the years, not because it was frightening exactly, but because of what it represented. The last ordinary act of care between them. A plastic jug of water handed off in a quiet hallway while the rest of the house slept, and then he walked upstairs. Ginger Alden found him in the bathroom later that morning, unresponsive, and what followed was chaos that none of the people present ever fully recovered from. For Nancy, the loudest thing in all of that noise was not a sound at all. It was the echo of something quiet, a man who had only wanted water and some sleep, a man who had seemed in that brief moment on the steps like he was going to be fine. For decades after that morning, the things that sat heaviest with her stayed inside her. She gave interviews occasionally. She answered fan letters. She never made Elvis a cautionary tale or a tragedy to be picked apart for entertainment. But in her final years, certain details began slipping out of her in the way things do when a person has simply held them long enough. She started talking more openly about the pills, how many there were, how systematic it all felt, and how the presence of doctors around Elvis never felt like healing. It felt like management. There is a difference between those two things, and Nancy knew it clearly. And that's when she said, during a small informal gathering in her final months, that she did not think Elvis died the way people had been told. Not really. The room went still. She was not suggesting a cover-up, not suggesting he had walked away to a quiet life somewhere. She was pointing at something more interior than any of that, at the way the accepted narrative had flattened a complicated man into a simple story about excess and collapse. Because in the days before he died, Elvis had been talking about starting over. That was the part she had never said publicly before. He told her, roughly a week before August 16th, that he wished he could just be a man again, somewhere quiet, away from the noise of being Elvis. Nancy repeated those words slowly when she finally spoke them aloud. "That is not something you say," she told the people listening, "if you have already given up." He had books upstairs on spirituality and personal transformation, and he was reading them. He had started noticing how much of his life had been shaped and controlled by other people's agendas, and something in him was pushing back against that quietly, imperfectly, but genuinely. Tired and in pain, yes, but trying. And she believed there was a difference between a man who was declining and a man who was trying. One final memory she shared had never been told to anyone before. A few days before he passed, Elvis asked her whether she believed people could really start over. She told him of course they could, if they wanted to badly enough. And he said maybe he would. Maybe one day he'd wake up and just leave all of it behind and disappear somewhere. He smiled when he said it, half joking, she thought, but she had never been entirely certain. All the years that followed, she turned that smile over in her mind, wondering whether it belonged to a man imagining something he intended to actually do, or a man grieving a version of himself he would never find his way back to. Those who heard her that day described her tone as something between a confession and a release, not dramatic, not bitter, just final in the way things sound when a person has carried them long enough and is ready to set them down. She had folded his shirts and cooked his midnight meals and handed him water on the last morning of his life, and now, near the end of her own, she gave him one more thing. She told the truth about who she believed he was. Not a rock and roll legend who crumbled under the weight of American celebrity culture, a man who was still reaching for something the morning he died. After she passed, her words moved slowly and deliberately through the people who cared about them, rippling through fan communities and quiet conversations between those who had spent years trying to understand Elvis Presley beyond the biography the public had been handed. Some were moved in ways they hadn't prepared for. Others questioned why she had waited so long, but those questions faded fast when people remembered what she had never done. She had never sold a story. She had never sought attention. She waited until it felt right, and then she spoke, and then she was gone. What remains is not a solved mystery. Nancy's words deepened it by making it human again. If Elvis was genuinely talking about escape and new beginnings in the days before August 16th, then what stopped him is not a simple question, and no one living can answer it with certainty. Those answers went with him, and with Nancy gone, another piece of the real story has followed, but not all of it. She made sure of that. She waited nearly half a century, then spoke. And what she offered was not a rewriting of history. It was the restoration of a person inside it, a man who wanted water on his last morning, who had been dreaming of somewhere quieter, who carried the weight of being a cultural icon on a body and a soul that were never built to hold that much. She did not want people to pity him. She wanted people to see him. And in her own unhurried, irreversible way, she made sure that finally, after all this time, they could.